Holcomb, retired United States Army Lieutenant General and former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. In leading the conversation is Atlantic Editor-in-Chief Jeffrey Goldberg.
And welcome to everyone. We're so glad this is the very first event of the Atlantic Festival. There's a lot riding on this, so if you brought your A game. I'm going to jump right in. There's so much to talk about, namely the entire world. But I want to start just by asking the question that probably is on everybody's mind about you and your career. Very successful Army leader. And for those of you who don't know, wrote the definitive book on called Dereliction of Duty while an Army officer, which examined the failure of the political class during the Vietnam period and the failure as it relates to managing the military. So you're not someone who's naive about politicians and not naive about civil military affairs, but when President Trump, in his first term, called and said, would you be the national security advisor? You said yes. So the question is, why did you say yes? And then what happened?
Well, hey, Jeff, what a privilege it is to be with you and to be with all of you here today. You know, President Trump was my 7th commander-in-chief. I took the oath of service on the plane at West Point when I was 17 years old. I had decided just not to vote in the model of George Marshall, to keep that kind of bold line in place between the military and partisan politics. And so when I got the call to interview for the job at Mar-a-Lago, I'd never met President Trump. I considered it kind of an easy decision to make, to serve my country, to serve the president who was elected. And in the job as National Security Advisor, I really felt, maybe naively, that I didn't have to be a partisan political person. I just had to get the president best advice, because I had written about why Vietnam became an American war, and during that period of time, how a lot of Lyndon Johnson's senior military as well as civilian advisors told the president what he wanted to hear. And what President Johnson wanted in this period of time during which Vietnam became an American war is he wanted to avoid a tough decision, because he was really viewing Vietnam mainly through the lens of his domestic priorities and did not want to make a tough decision that might alienate key constituencies on which his re-election depended, his election, because remember he took over after the assassination of JFK in November of 1963. And so getting elected in his own right in 1964 and then passing the Great Society legislation in 65. So I thought, okay, as a serving military officer, I stayed in uniform. I wore civilian clothes. I wore bad suits, according to the president. He said I looked like a beer salesman. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Kind of mean.
I remember that.
So
yes.
I hope I've upgraded my look to purveyor of fine scotches. That's what I'm.
And there's nothing wrong with beer salesmen, by the way. I don't know why that's an insult.
But it was an easy decision to make, and it was a privilege to serve. And your job as National Security Advisor is unique because you're the only person, when there is one, in the national security establishment, the foreign policy establishment, who has the president as his or her only client. So it's your job, I believe, as National Security Advisor, to get the president best advice and get the president multiple options. Because the president's the person who got elected, it should be the president's choice, and it's through the comparison of those options where you can draw out advantages and disadvantages, long-term costs and consequences. And I think as a National Security Advisor also, you have the role of being kind of the guardian of the president's independence of judgment. Because you see with President Trump, you see with every president, the president is the object of sustained influence campaigns by foreign influence, by people domestically who want the president not to make maybe the best decision for Americans, but who want to manipulate decisions consistent with their own agendas. So I think it's a very important position. It was a privilege to do it. If I went back to 2017 again, I'd do it again.
You would?
I would do it again. But, I wouldn't do it now, again, like now, but if I went back in time, I would do it again.
Why wouldn't you do it now? Because you understand him now?
Well, I'm kind of used up with President Trump, It's not a secret or anything. And I left on very good terms with him. I wish him well. I hope he succeeds because I want our country to succeed. But I mean, you may have noticed he doesn't take criticism very well, you know? And so he, even when I do criticize his policies, it's his policies because I want it to be helpful, you know, but he doesn't see it that way, I don't think. And I think he's a bit different now. He's less patient. He has a deeper sense of aggrievement, you know, some which is justified. And he's less patient, right? And I think he has been convinced, really, by some of the people around him that his own staff was kind of the deep state, right? So the National Security Council staff is gutted, the NEC, the National Economic Council, is kind of gutted. And meanwhile, the departments and agencies I think are influenced by people who reflect kind of some of President Trump's dissonance, right? The opposing views he has in his head, right? Like peace through strength, President Trump is you know, oftentimes then vacillates over to, you know, a President Trump who is prone toward retrenchment, right? And disengagement.
I want to ask you in a minute about whether or not there is a consistent Trump doctrine. But just stay on this one point about the National Security Council. It's a little bit granular, but I think it's important. You ran the National Security Council. They have, as you said, gutted it. It's half or a third of the size. There's an argument to be made that it was bloated. It got bigger and bigger and bigger as time went on. What is the issue that you have with the trimming down, the gutting, whatever you want to call it, of the National Security Council?
Right. I think the National Security Council staff did get too big. It got too big under President Obama. It got too big again under President Biden. We actually cut it way back in Trump 1 as well. The key is really not the size of it, it's the function. Right? Do you understand what your role is as National Security Advisor? This is what Epictetus taught us, right? This is what is most important, to play well the role assigned you. I think when National Security Council staffs, National Security Advisors begin to direct policy, to centralize authority, well, that's the National Security Advisor's job is not that. Your job is to coordinate and integrate efforts across the departments and agencies to get that president multiple options, right? And then to assist with the sensible and sort of integrated execution, implementation of the president's decisions and policies. And you need a body to do that because nobody, you know, other cabinet officials don't work for the Secretary of State, for example, right? And so you need to have that kind of a venue that brings, you know, the president's cabinet together, other advisors together, heads of departments and agencies, to determine how to integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to secure the nation, promote American prosperity. That's the kind of integration you need to have a consistent, well-thought-out foreign policy and an economic policy as well.
You know who hasn't read Epictetus or any of the Stoics? Donald Trump. Just noting that. Let's talk about something that's been going on, many unpleasant and terrible things going on in the last couple of weeks in America, but there's one area that is of particular concern to you. We have seen, American intelligence has seen, extraordinary efforts by Chinese, Russian, Iranian state actors to interfere in the social media, in our social media, around the Charlie Kirk assassination in order to literally foment division in American society. We're very open to being divided now, obviously, but talk about that and what motivates. In particular, let's focus on China because it's the biggest player in that bunch. But what is going on right now?
Well, China and Russia are the two leaders together who are waging a sustained campaign of what I would call cognitive warfare against America and against the West broadly. And really what they want to do more than anything is diminish our confidence in who we are as a people, our common identity as Americans, drive us apart from one another, pit us against each other, and then also they want to reduce our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. So, for example, you know, President Trump had this cloud of the Russia investigation over him in 2017 in his first term, and it turns out that these were false allegations of collusion and so forth. But the Russians won, right? They won because I don't think the Russians care who wins our elections. What they really care about most is that a large number of Americans doubt the legitimacy of the results. So those who were, you know, saying the Russiagate thing in 2017, 2018, politicians and people in the media, they were playing into the Russians' hands. President Trump played into the Russians' hands in his denial of the 2020 election. So what we really need at this point is to recognize this threat to our security, right? And to maybe use that as a basis for coming together, right? To come together for respectful, meaningful discussions about how we build a better future together.
What does Russia want, and what does China want?
Okay, so what both of them want and why they've joined into this partnership with no limits. I mean, look at those images from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right? Go back to when they declared their undying love for one another with the partnership with no limits right before the Ukraine invasion, massive reinvasion in 2022, right before the Beijing Olympics, right? And what you'll hear them say, and Xi Jinping in particular, will use this phrase, we're seeing changes like we haven't seen in 100 years. And Vladimir, you and I are driving some of those changes. It's chaos, and the chaos is in our favor. What they really want to do is tear down the existing rules of international discourse and replace them with a new set of rules that are sympathetic to their authoritarian form of governance, and in China's case in particular, its statist mercantilist economic model. Now, their strategies for doing that are complementary to one another. Russia knows it can't really compete with us economically, right? The economy's the size of Italy's economy. But Putin is operating under the theory that he can drag everybody else down, under the theory that he can be the last person standing. So this sustained campaign of cognitive warfare is not only against us, but it's against Europe. It's against the West broadly. And Russia has combined that with the massive onslaught against Ukraine, but also with other actions, like propping up the Assad regime and supporting the serial episodes of mass homicide that created a huge migration crisis that then divided Europe even further and diminished their confidence, right, in their common identity as Europeans within those countries. And they're also conducting a shadow war against the West. I mean, they're cutting undersea cables. They're blowing up warehouses. They put out a contract, to assassinate the head of a major defense firm in Europe. And so I think we have to recognize this threat, Jeff. I mean, I think it's past time for us to recognize that we are under assault in these various forms by what I would call an axis of aggressors. I would add the theocratic dictatorship in Iran to that list. I mean, they're part of the club, North Korea, they're in on it, right? They're sending, tens of thousands of troops to fight on European soil with the Russians against Ukraine. They're providing 10 million, probably, artillery rounds to the Ukrainians. And the Iranians are providing the Shahed drones. So this axis has coalesced. This is, I think, our gravest threat. And we have to act, like we know that we're in a very significant competition that's going to affect the security of our kids if we don't.
Does the President of the United States understand this the way you understand it?
I think so. I think so, but I think his tactics, like the way he's gone about it, has been counterproductive initially, but I think what I see is the Trump administration backing in to what I think would be an effective policy. So what do I mean by that? I think that he has been operating under the illusion that he could do like a reverse Nixon, a reverse Kissinger. You hear that, right, about how you can divide Russia and China. And this is consistent with geostrategists of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Spikeman and others, who were writing about you can't have a hostile power dominate the world island, right, of the Eurasian landmass. So it makes sense to divide them. But it's not the Cold War anymore, right? And China and Russia are completely in league with one another, and I think it is to our advantage to instead glue them together. Not only because they deserve each other, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, but also when we pretend like they're separate from one another, we give them space to cover for one another. I mean, just think of how foolhardy it was to engage China, this is during the Biden administration, to say, oh, could you please get the Iranians to moderate a little bit in the Middle East? I mean, that was a fool's errand. And all it did was invite them further into the Middle East in terms of influence and so forth. So I think what is really, and this is what everybody's reading in the newspaper every day, it's past time to put pressure on this axis of aggressors, Russia in particular in the short term, to really impose costs on Russia such that Vladimir Putin concludes he can no longer continue this onslaught against Ukraine at an acceptable cost. That's the only way that you're going to get to any kind of a ceasefire, I believe, in Ukraine. Putin will not stop until he is stopped. And I believe that this axis of aggressors, Jeff, they're in a position of profound weakness. We should be kind of confident right now. I mean, our democracy is ugly. We have this hyper-partisanship. Charlie Kirk's murder is one example, of how divided we are and the reaction to it and so forth. But all that ugliness is out in the open for us. These authoritarian regimes, they look really good on parade, right? That was a beautiful parade in Beijing, right? Really impressive. But they're actually quite brittle, right? They're really quite brittle. and they've created big problems for themselves. All of them have overextended based on the perception of American and Western weakness.
Well, this is the question. Is it a perception or is it a reality? And I just want to push back on this Trump-Russia discourse a little bit. I mean, you are, of all the people in this room, until Mike Pence gets here in 10 minutes, until all the people in this room, you know Trump best on the subject of Russia, among other things. I mean, it doesn't seem, here's the question about Trump to me. It doesn't seem like he has the ideals about the superiority of the American or Western democratic model, the same ideals that all presidents previously, including Democratic and Republican presidents, have had. It's a very mercantilist approach. It's, you give me, you're screwing me on trade, I'm going to screw you on trade. I want to do deals with you. I don't care about your human rights posture. I don't care what you do in other countries, as long as you leave us alone and as long as you let us sell our goods there. It doesn't, I mean, if I'm Putin or Xi Jinping, I'm asking myself a very basic question. If I'm Putin and I go into Poland or the Baltics, is Trump really going to respond? If I'm Xi Jinping, do I cross the Taiwan Strait? Because Trump might not actually put America in harm's way to protect Taiwan. So, I mean, that's, you know him. Like, what, is there an ideology, or let me more to the point, is there an idealism of any sort that motivates him about the American message in the world?
Yeah. Well, he does care about violence and death, and it does affect him. I remember when he took pretty strong action against Russia after the, or against Syria in 2017, after the poisoning, the mass murder with nerve agents of hundreds of people, including scores of children. But he does have this, you alluded to this, kind of this moral equivalence. And a lot of this is rooted in his belief that America's been taken advantage of, right? And he taps in, obviously, to a lot of his political support by talking to people who feel like American elites have been more concerned about, like, the phrase they hate, the liberal international order, than they were about, like, their jobs, And so these are people who have been buffeted by big transitions in the global economy that occurred, especially after China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, the loss of those manufacturing jobs. Then you had the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Hey, toss in an opioid epidemic, and then all the negative effects of social media, right? So it's that kind of sense of anger, resentment from those traumas that President Trump brings with him. This is, again, this is kind of like sense of aggrievement, and that we've been taken advantage of. And, he has a point, like on Europe, for example. Europe accounts for about 19% of the world's GDP and about 50% of the world's social spending. So a lot of Americans were saying, okay, why are we covering their defense bills and underwriting their social programs? All of that's valid. But what happens is he then, I think, takes this contrary view to these authoritarians, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, that does have an air of moral equivalence to it, but also he wants a big deal. Like, he thinks that he's the person who can get the big deal with Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping.
Does he think that everything is a real estate deal and that you just go to Xi Jinping and say, look, we can work this out, not understanding that Putin and Xi Jinping have world historical visions of their own role and the role of their nations in the construction of the planet?
Well, I think he undervalues the degree to which ideology and emotion drive and constrain leaders like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And he's not alone there, okay? So when I would advise him before meetings and phone calls with Vladimir Putin, I would just say to him, hey, here's the checklist. Putin's going to go down with you. He's going to flatter you, right? That's the first thing he's going to do. The second thing he's going to do is he's going to highlight his sense of aggrievement, how poorly he's been treated and misunderstood, right? It was really NATO enlargement that made us feel so cornered and forced us
to attack Ukraine because you were mean.
Right. So it's highlight the sense of aggrievement and make it like a mutual sense of agreement, just like you've been treated unfairly, President Trump. I've been treated unfairly too, right? The third thing is the prospect of a big deal. He'll bring other issues to the table. For example, like, hey, we can work together on counterterrorism, or laughably, like cybersecurity, or he'll say, or now it's like nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, right? Where we could do great things together, Donald, and then the fourth thing that he'll do is he'll portray any alternative to that as weak, or any person who might put forward an alternative like Zelensky as weak, right? So you can just go right down that checklist, And I would warn him about that, but I would also say, hey, this is similar to the way Vladimir Putin played George W. Bush, remember, who looked into Putin's soul and saw a guy who really cares about his people, right? And then you had President Obama with the reset approach, even after the invasion of Georgia had happened. Really? How is that going to work with Putin? So, and I would say,
is that the way the calls actually went?
Oh, yeah.
And you were on the call. You're
yes,
listening to
yes,
this.
Yeah, that's how and you can see.
Are you like screaming on the inside? Don't. No. He doesnn't mean it. Like he doesn't think you're the greatest thing since egg salad or whatever.
No, I would just say it directly to him. I'd just say it directly to him. I would just say, hey, just don't be a chump about this. I mean, everybody else has.
So
how long did he play Angela Merkel, right? And then even President Biden, even after on the eve of Ukraine, going to Geneva, laying out red lines. You know what that means to Putin? Well, it's a green light for everything else, right? And falling into the same trap. All we need to do is allay Putin's security concerns. We forget Vladimir Putin is a man who is obsessed. He's obsessed with restoring Russia to national greatness and to do so by reestablishing the Russian Empire. And that obsession is based on really the sense of honor lost associated with the breakup of the Soviet Union. And he's not going to change, right? He's not going to stop until he's stopped. There's not going to be a big, beautiful deal with Vladimir Putin or actually with Xi Jinping. So if you think about it, President Trump went through this cycle with Iran as well, right? I thought he was going to be tough on Iran from the beginning, but he was kind of softer on Iran initially. Remember, he gave him the 60 days, and then the 60-day clock ran out, and he did act directly against Iran. I think he's backing into the same sort of situation with Russia now.
But Iran is a smaller, weaker power.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But people didn't act that way for a long time because we never acted like we knew what the return address was.
Okay, so
Iran was doing.
Here's the key question. Xi Jinping, they're not ready yet to cross the strait, right? But they're preparing to take Taiwan if the opportunity affords itself. Right. The key variable is Xi Jinping thinking to himself, if I do this, is Donald Trump going to try kinetically to stop me? In other words, is he going to use American military power to defend Taiwan? The question is, do you think Donald Trump will use American military power to defend Taiwan?
Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, and the key is to make sure that Xi Jinping still.
That was kind of just, I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know because
Can you give us something more than that?
Well, obviously it's a pretty consequential decision. Yeah. Right. Even though President Trump actually thinks that Article 2 of the Constitution is apparently unlimited in his power, the Congress, the American people should have a say in whether or not we go to war with China, I would think. So I just don't know how that would play out. There were so many variables, Jeff, like, what happens, as a lead up to an invasion of Taiwan? Is there a soft blockade? Is there a hard blockade or a so-called quarantine? Do we respond to that first? Do we start reflagging and escorting ships, to Taiwan? How responsible is Taiwan for its own security? Have we addressed the backlog of about $21 billion of arms sales to Taiwan and delivered them? Has the increased length of time for conscription in the Taiwanese forces led to a qualitative improvement in the force such that the People's Liberation Army and the people who advise Xi Jinping say, hey, I don't know if we can do this, So there are a lot of variables at play here that it's really hard to say, like, if President Trump would do it or not. President Biden, of course, said 4 times that he would defend Taiwan, but I don't think anybody really believed he meant that, that he was really solid on that change from strategic ambiguity, the policy, toward Taiwan to this, definite, we will defend Taiwan.
And so an even bigger question is, if Russia decide, let's say they continue or have more success in Ukraine, if they decide that, we really do have, Putin's goal in his lifetime is to reconstitute the territory of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. If he looks at the Baltics and says, we can swallow them, do you think that Article 5, that the members of NATO will honor the commitment made to each other and come in? You think the United States would go to war with Russia over the Baltic states?
Yes.
And you think Donald Trump would, even though he has these quasi-isolationist tendencies?
I do. And he would draw Article 5 into question. And I would always advise, please don't do that. I mean, I tell the story in my book about our drive out to NATO headquarters when he had, at the last minute, put a couple of sentences in there that I, along with the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, convinced him to take out. because this
Tell
is part.
Tell them what the lines were.
So the lines were basically, we're not going to defend you unless you pay not only your 2% Wales pledge, but like arrears. Like he had this idea of arrears in defense. But the theme of burden sharing in defense, that was a legitimate theme, right? And one of the tendencies with President Trump is he's very disruptive. There's a lot that needs to be disrupted, but then he becomes so disruptive that he disrupts his own agenda and becomes the antagonist in his own story, right? So for example, like if you want to argue against Chinese companies running both ends of the Panama Canal, you make an argument in favor of Panamanian sovereignty. You say, hey, Panama, our friend, this is not good for you. We're on the side of sovereignty. Let us help you figure out a deal where we can get this to a U.S. or an international company. Instead, he says, hey, we're going to take over the canal. Well, then it puts you in the same boat as the Chinese in terms of undermining sovereignty. The same thing with Greenland. So the key is, what he needs is, I think, advice that first of all clarifies what he wants to achieve. This is what we did, and I think we did very effectively 2017 to 2018, and then examine, give him courses of action, right? If a course of action that he has in mind is to do something that you think is not realistic, still show that course of action, but then evaluate it relative to what the goals and objectives he wants to accomplish, and provide him with some alternatives. Like he would say, for example, hey, General, why don't we just bomb them? I'm like, well, who do you have in mind? And the labs in Mexico. And then that would freak some people out, right? So then we would come in a little huddle outside of the Oval Office, like, oh my gosh, are we going to bomb Mexico, right? I said, listen, what he's saying is 90,000 Americans at the time are dying every year from fentanyl poisoning. And what we're doing isn't working, and he wants options, And so, I hope that he's got the team around him that can still do that work. Yeah. I was a fan of Mike Waltz. I mean, I can say that now because if I had said it earlier, it would have really killed him probably. But I think he was doing the best job he could to provide the president with that kind of a model as National Security Advisor, somebody that gives the president best analysis and multiple options.
Yeah. I like Mike too. We used to chat.
You guys were on the chat together. Absolutely.
Look, I could listen to you. I could listen to you all day. I'm sure they could. We have to wrap it up, but I want to thank you very much for this amazing overview of where we are. It's not comforting, but it's illuminating. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.